Good morning and namaste. We are about to begin our inaugural session of the three-day national seminar on impact of literature on Indian freedom movement, which is in fact part of the Festival of Letters 2022. At the outset, I request Professor Chandrasekhar Kambarji, President, Sahitya Akademi, to welcome Honorable Vishwanath Prasad Tiwari ji, who is going to inaugurate the seminar. I request Dr. K. Srinivas Rao ji, Secretary, Sahitya Akademi, to welcome Professor Harish Trivedi ji, who is going to deliver keynote address. I request Dr. K. Srinivas Rao ji now to welcome the dignitaries as well as the audience formally.
Namaskar and good morning to all of you. Respected Professor Vishwanath Prasad Tiwari ji, former President and Fellow of Sahitya Academy. Respected Professor Chandrasekhar Kambarji, President Sahitya Academy. Professor Harish Trivedi ji, writer and scholar, and the keynote speaker in the morning session. Sri Madhav Kaushik ji, Vice President Sahitya Academy. Chairpersons of various sessions, all the paper presenters and friends. I am glad to welcome all of you for this national seminar on impact of literature on Indian freedom movement. Friends, of all the freedom movements in the world until date, Indian independence movement should rank as one of the most inspired independence movements of all time. Revolutions always belong to the masses. How much inspired and worked up the masses are determines the ferocity of the movement, and how formidable the opponents are determines the longevity of the movement. All movements are movements countering hegemony of various types. As the movements are rising up against the hegemony, they are part and parcel of every era in the annals of histories of human civilizations. The movements are often triggered by certain event or a series of events that are not acceptable to the majority of the society, and as such, movements can be equated with the majority will of the society. No social evolution is really possible without movements and counter movements. These two collide with each other and lead to a new order in the society, just like thesis, antithesis, synthesis of Hegel. Here the resistance and movements were against the Britishers who occupied and ruled India for 2 centuries. Before that, Mughal were ruling India. So collectively Indian independence movement was the representation of aspiration and will of masses to be free, people who wanted their country to be an independence nation. Though Indian independence movement is often counted from 1857, that which culminated in 1947, it is a collective movement by the people aspiring to be free in a nation devoid of any subjugation, war and alien rulers. There is no denying that great leaders like Gokhale, Motilal Nehru, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Mahatma Gandhi, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sri Aurobindo, B.R. Ambedkar, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and others who bound the masses to fight in unity. But What underlies those efforts is the role played by literature, and that is severely understated. However, some may question and wonder how literary productions can gather and glue millions of people for such a long time. The role of literature in any mass movement is very cleanly established, yet hugely understated and unrecognized. Across nations and over many centuries, it is an indisputable fact that well-written literary works impact, influence, and energize movements, inspire millions, and move nations, nay, continents. The writings of Karl Marx, Tolstoy, and Mahatma Gandhi are but few examples for this. This literature is of two kinds, as I see it, written as published in the form of books, journals, and newspaper writings on the one hand, and unwritten in the form of ballads, songs, folk arts in the vast rural spaces of India. In this, the latter does not always get due recognition. I am glad that the seminar scholars will focus on that also. The unwritten part is very important, also given that India's literacy rate during the independence movement was very low and vast majority of that population included women and infants. Patriotic songs, ballads, songs with the theme of freedom during agriculture activities and home-based activities, folk dances, folk arts, folk tales played a major role in carrying the message of independence movement to that section of the population. Another function that these unwritten literatures in the form of folk songs played was to inculcate the sense of nationalism and patriotism in children from a very young age through their mothers. This went a long way in making the millions of young men and women ready when the time for the final push for freedom came. Mothers and grandmothers from all over the country ensured this. Journals and dailies had the maximum impact in the 50 years running up to 1947. Book publishers were scarce and books were expensive at that time as they had fewer takers, and journals and magazines along with the news dailies filled the role usually played by the books in propagating information effectively. As the censoring was high for nationalist news, many journals took to short stories and poems to propagate the nationalistic and patriotic messages. In fact, that is the period in addition to the first decade and a half after independence when literature found favorable space in the news outlets. This was true in all languages. When it comes to books, great writings of stalwarts like Balagangadhar Tilak, Mahatma Gandhi, Subramanya Bharati, V. Menon, Sri Aurobindo, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Maithili Sharan Gupta, and many distinguished writers provided the requisite impetus and were central catalysts in the freedom movement. Anandamath by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is one single book that shook the nation and galvanized the communities throughout the land. Translations into local languages provided easy access to literate masses, and they in turn spread the message and charm of Anandamath to everyone in their communities. Later, when Gandhian ideals gained popular currency, when novels and the Gandhian thought in the center appeared in almost every language ranging from Gore Bhaire by Tagore to Untouchable by Mulkraj Anand to Kantapura by Rajarao to poems of Subramanya Bharati, collected as a book are some of the many that appeared in that period. Of course, Gandhi's writings, along with that of Tilak in the social and political spectrum, and that of Sri Aurobindo in the spiritual side, to the literary works of Munshi Premchand and Bharat Bharati by Maithili Sharan Gupta gave more than a mere impetus to the independence movement. I have not given comprehensive and a complete picture of literary works of patriotic nature, and I have just touched upon them. So, short stories, poems, plays, spiritual writings and songs in the form of books or through journals energized millions of Indians, and Indians responded with great strength and energy and rose in unison as a single voice of the nation. Sri Aurobindo once wrote that, I quote, Unhappy is the man or the nation which, when the divine moment arrives, is found sleeping or unprepared to use it, because the lamp has not been kept trimmed for the welcome and the ears are sealed to the call. But thrice woe to them who are strong and ready, yet waste the force or misuse the moment. For them is irreparable loss or a great destruction. Unquote. India and Indians were ready and roaring when the clarion call was received, and the entire nation rose as one energy, as one personality, burying all the differences, and all this was possible thanks to literary impact on the independence movement and in the ways I just mentioned. I sincerely hope all the participants and the audience stand benefited from this national seminar. Like all of you, I am also eager to all the experts and scholars over the next 3 days and benefit. With these few words, I am glad to welcome all of you once again. Thank you all.
Well, thanks a lot, sir, for so briefly and aptly informing about the concept of the seminar. Now, let us, with all humility, invite Professor Vishwanath Prasad Tiwari ji to inaugurate this seminar with his words. I only formally introduce the one who has already been known to the globe. Professor Vishwanath Prasad Tiwari ji, former president of the Sahitya Academy. He is a distinguished Indian poet and writer in Hindi and fellow of Sahitya Academy. He was professor and head Department of Hindi in Gorakhpur University until his retirement in 2001. Professor Tiwari has more than 50 books to his credit. He has been editing Dastavez, a quarterly literary journal being published from Gorakhpur, Uttar Pradesh. Professor Tiwari is a recipient of innumerable awards, some of which are Saraswati Samman, Pushkin Samman, Hindi Gaurav Samman, Vyas Samman, and many others. I request Professor Tiwari ji to kindly inaugurate this seminar.
आदरणीय श्री चंद्रशेखर कंबार जी, श्री हरीश त्रिवेदी जी, श्री माधव कौशिक जी, श्री के श्रीनिवास राव जी तथा मेरे सामने बैठे सभी आदरणीय सज्जनों, साहित्य अकादमी के प्रति आभार प्रकट करते हुए मुझे जो कुछ कहना है समय बचाने के लिए मैं लिखित रूप में उसे आपके सामने पढ़ना चाहता हूँ। स्वाधीनता मानवीय शब्दकोश का सबसे पवित्र शब्द है। उसकी चेतना मनुष्य ही नहीं, जीव मात्र में नैसर्गिक रूप में विद्यमान होती है। वह मनुष्य का चरम मूल्य है, उसके अस्ति का आधार। जो स्वाधीन नहीं है वह किसी कर्म का उत्तरदायी भी नहीं माना जा सकता। दुनिया भर के मनुष्य ने स्वाधीनता के लिए जितने बलिदान दिए हैं शायद ही किसी अन्य मूल्य के लिए दिए हों। स्वाधीनता ही साहित्य का भी आधार है और स्वप्न है। दुनिया का अधिकांश साहित्य उसी की अभिव्यक्ति है। साहित्य अपने चतुर्दिक जीवन प्रवाह, भाव और विचार से न केवल स्वयं प्रभावित होता है बल्कि उसे भी प्रभावित करता है। संसार में जितनी भी क्रांतियां हुई हैं उनके पीछे लेखकों और विचारकों की महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका रही है। 1789 की फ्रांसीसी क्रांति, जिसने सभी देशों के समाजों और बुद्धिजीवियों को प्रभावित किया, के पीछे वॉल्टेयर, मोंटेस्क्यू और रूसो की कृतियों का प्रभाव स्वीकार किया जाता है। वॉल्टेयर व्यक्तिगत स्वतंत्रता, अभिव्यक्ति और विचारों की स्वतंत्रता तथा धार्मिक सहिष्णुता के समर्थक थे। मोंटेस्क्यू ने राजतंत्र की स्वेच्छाचारिता और निरंकुशता का विरोध करते हुए लोकतांत्रिक व्यवस्था का समर्थन किया था। रूसो ने सोशल कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में जो अवधारणा व्यक्त की, उसे भविष्य में आने वाले लोकतंत्र का बीज माना जाता है। महात्मा गांधी के 1917 की रूसी क्रांति के पीछे कार्ल मार्क्स और लेनिन के क्रांतिकारी विचार थे। महात्मा गांधी के नेतृत्व में चलने वाले भारतीय स्वाधीनता संग्राम, जिसमें सैकड़ों नेता हिस्सेदार थे, के मात्र 40-50 वर्षों पहले भारत में स्वाधीनता के लिए एक और महासंग्राम हो चुका था 1857 में, जिसे अंग्रेज इतिहासकारों ने सिपाही गदर या फौजी बगावत कहा है। इस महासंग्राम के दरमियान और इसके बाद भारतीय साहित्य में जो देशभक्तिपूर्ण लेखन हुआ, उसका गहरा प्रभाव स्वाधीनता आंदोलन पर पड़ा। अंतर यह रहा कि वह संग्राम हिंसात्मक था, जबकि गांधी का आंदोलन अहिंसात्मक। 1857 में बहादुर शाह जफर अंतिम मुगल सम्राट के रूप में दिल्ली के तख्त पर आसीन थे, जो स्वयं शायर थे। इस जंगे आजादी में उनका एक शेर उद्धृत किया जाता रहा, बागियों में बू रहेगी जब तलक ईमान की, तख्ते लंदन तक चलेगी तेग हिंदुस्तान की। अंग्रेजों ने बहादुर शाह जफर के साथ बर्बर व्यवहार किया। उनके 2 शहजादों को गोली मारकर उनके सिर काट लिए गए। उस समय मशहूर शायर मिर्जा गालिब भी दिल्ली में सांस ले रहे थे। गालिब और जफर की शायरी में जो गाढ़ा दुख बोध, ट्रेजिक सेंस है, उसके पीछे 1857 की घटनाएं भी हैं। विद्रोह के दमन के बाद दिल्ली के लोगों, विशेषकर मुसलमानों पर अंग्रेजों के अत्याचार का पहाड़ टूट पड़ा। गालिब के एक मित्र और विद्वान कवि इमाम बख्श को उनके 2 पुत्रों सहित गोली मार दी गई तथा कई अन्य विद्वानों और शायरों का कत्ल कर दिया गया अथवा उन्हें जेल या अंडमान भेज दिया गया। अलाउद्दीन अलाई के नाम एक खत में उन दिनों की दिल्ली के बारे में गालिब लिखते हैं, घर से बाजार में निकलते हुए जहरा होता है आप इंसान का, चौक जिसको कहें वो मक्तल है बदस्तल, चौक जिसको कहें वो मक्तल है, घर बना है नमूना जिंदा का, शहर दिल्ली का जर्रा जर्रा खाक, तिस्नाए खून है हर मुसलमान का, कोई वहां से न यहां आ सके, आदमी वहां न जा सके यहां का। गालिब सांकेतिक अभिव्यक्ति में माहिर शायर हैं, जो अक्सर अपनी शायरी को बहुअर्थी बनाकर 1857 के अपने समय को व्यक्त करते हैं, ताकि वह उनके और उनके मित्रों के लिए खतरा न बने। इसके नमूने ख्वाजा हसन निजामी की गालिब का रोजनामचा में उपलब्ध है। उस समय लिखे गए गालिब के पत्रों खुतूते गालिब में दिल्ली, जो एक सैनिक छावनी में तब्दील हो गई थी, के हालात के बारे में देखी और भोगी हुई सूचनाएं हैं। इसी प्रकार जहीर देहलवी की पुस्तक दास्ताने गदर उस काल की सच्ची जानकारी देती है। 1857 में हिंदी के युग प्रवर्तक लेखक भारतेंदु हरिश्चंद्र 7 वर्ष के बालक थे। जैसे राजा राम मोहन राय बंगाल नवजागरण के अग्रदूत माने जाते हैं, वैसे ही भारतेंदु हरिश्चंद्र हिंदी नवजागरण के। मात्र 35 वर्षों के अपने अल्प जीवन काल में उन्होंने न केवल विपुल लेखन किया, बल्कि लेखकों का एक मंडल भी तैयार किया, जो हिंदी साहित्य के इतिहास में भारतेंदु मंडल के नाम से जाना जाता है। इस मंडल के अन्य लेखक हैं बालकृष्ण भट्ट, प्रताप नारायण मिश्र, बद्री नारायण चौधरी, प्रेमघन आदि। इस मंडल ने अपने लेखन में अंग्रेजी राज के भारत की बदहाली की कठोर आलोचना की। उस समय भारत में आर्थिक दुर्दशा, कंगाली, शोषण, अत्याचार और अकाल की स्थिति थी। अपने नाटक भारत दुर्दशा में भारतेंदु लिखते हैं, हा हा भारत दुर्दशा न देखी जाई, भय अंध पंग सब दीनहीन बिलखाई, अंग्रेज राज सुख साज सजे सब भारी, पै धन विदेश चल जाते यह अति ख्वारी। यहां विशेष रूप से रेखांकित करना चाहूंगा कि भारतेंदु युग के लेखकों ने सबसे मुखर आवाज लगाई स्वदेशी और स्वभाषा के पक्ष में। कहना न होगा कि महात्मा गांधी ने भी इन दो मुद्दों को महत्व देकर के उठाया। भारतेंदु के जीवन काल में ही एक और हिंदी लेखक उभरे, बाल मुकुंद गुप्त, जिन्होंने शिवशंभु के कल्पित नाम से तत्कालीन वाइसराय लॉर्ड कर्जन को पत्र शैली में 8 चिट्ठे लिखे, जो शिवशंभु के चिट्ठे नाम से प्रसिद्ध हैं। ये भारत मित्र में प्रकाशित हुए थे। व्यंग्य और विनोद की विशिष्ट शैली में लिखे इन चिट्ठों में लॉर्ड कर्जन के अहंकार, अत्याचार और भारत विरोधी नीति पर कड़ा प्रहार किया गया है। ज्ञातव्य है कि बंगाल का विभाजन लॉर्ड कर्जन की ही चाल थी। बाल मुकुंद गुप्त ने कर्जन शाही शीर्षक से कुछ और लेख लिखे थे, जिनमें जनता की दुर्दशा वर्णित है। यही वह समय है जब बंगाल के साहित्याकाश में बंकिम चंद्र चट्टोपाध्याय का उदय हुआ। 1882 में उनका उपन्यास आनंद मठ प्रकाशित हुआ, जिसकी कथा 1778-79 के सन्यासी विद्रोह पर आधारित थी। इस उपन्यास का एक गीत वंदे मातरम बाद में राष्ट्रीय स्वाधीनता आंदोलन में आंदोलनकारियों का नारा बनकर गूंजा और जिसे देशभक्त क्रांतिकारियों खुदीराम बोस, राम प्रसाद बिस्मिल, चंद्रशेखर आजाद, भगत सिंह, राजगुरु, अशफाकुल्ला आदि ने भी गाया। 1878 में रविन्द्रनाथ टैगोर 17 वर्ष के नवयुवक थे। उन्होंने 1857 के सेनानियों रानी लक्ष्मीबाई, तात्या टोपे, कुंवर सिंह की वीरता और उनके साहस की प्रशंसा की तथा उन्हें राष्ट्र नायक के रूप में याद किया। इस संदर्भ में हेमचंद बंदोपाध्याय का भारत संगीत और अन्य कविताएं भी उल्लेखनीय हैं। 1857 की ज्वाला आगे भी लोक चित्त में जलती रही। उत्तर भारत की बोलियों में गाए जाने वाले लोकगीत, जिनकी संख्या बहुत अधिक है, इस महासंग्राम के प्रति लोक की देशभक्त पूर्ण भावनाओं को व्यक्त करती हैं। इनमें सबसे अधिक गीत रानी लक्ष्मीबाई और कुंवर सिंह के संबंध में है। लक्ष्मीबाई 29 वर्ष की अवस्था में अपने शिशु को पीठ पर बांधकर रण क्षेत्र में कूद पड़ी थी और भोजपुर के कुंवर सिंह ने अंग्रेजी सेना के विरुद्ध जब मोर्चा संभाला था तो उनकी उम्र 80 वर्ष थी। भोजपुरी की एक मार्मिक लोरी में मां अपने अबोध बालक को सुनाती है, हमारे दादा ने हमारी इज्जत, हमारी धरती, हमारे धर्म, हमारी गायों को बचाने के लिए उठाई तलवार। तब 80 की थी उनकी उम्र। चलते चलते कांपता था उनका सिर, बगुले जैसे सफेद थे उनके बाल, 32 में से एक भी न था दांत। हमारे दादा ने उस समय उठाई तलवार। बुंदेली लोक गीतों में रानी लक्ष्मीबाई के अदम्य साहस और बलिदान की गाथा भरी पड़ी है। लोक चित्त बहुत महत्वपूर्ण होता है। 1857 के दमन के बाद इसी लोक चित्त ने उस चिनगारी को गीतों और गाथाओं में जीवित रखकर आगे के कवियों और स्वाधीनता आंदोलन के सिपाहियों तक पहुंचाया। हिंदी में राष्ट्रीय काव्यधारा की प्रमुख कवित्री सुभद्रा कुमारी चौहान को लक्ष्मीबाई की शौर्य गाथा इन्हीं लोक गायकों बुंदेले हरबोलों से प्राप्त हुई थी, जिसका उल्लेख उन्होंने अपनी अमर कविता झांसी की रानी में किया है। बुंदेले हरबोलों के मुख हमने सुनी कहानी थी, खूब लड़ी मर्दानी हो तो झांसी वाली रानी थी। झांसी की रानी पर वृंदावन लाल वर्मा और महाश्वेता देवी ने उपन्यास लिखा। 1857 के बाद जो अंग्रेजी शासन के विरुद्ध देशभक्ति की भावना प्रवाहित हुई, उसमें भारतीय संस्कृति और भारत के अतीत गौरव का भाव दिखाई पड़ता है, जिसे एक पुनरुत्थान और राष्ट्रवाद भी कह सकते हैं। बंगाली महाप्रभुओं के बंगाल जागरण और हिंदी प्रदेश के भारतेंदु युग के नव जागरण साहित्य में इसकी झलक दिखाई पड़ती है। 18वीं शताब्दी के उत्तरार्ध और 19वीं शताब्दी के पूर्वार्ध के आसपास का यह वह समय है जब भारतीय इतिहास ने विभिन्न क्षेत्रों में सर्वाधिक महान प्रतिभाओं को जन्म दिया, जिन्होंने भारतीय गरिमा को पश्चिमी राष्ट्रों के समक्ष स्थापित किया। स्वामी दयानंद, श्री अरविंद और स्वामी विवेकानंद ऐसे ही व्यक्तित्व थे जिनसे बाल गंगाधर तिलक, राम प्रसाद बिस्मिल, सुभाष चंद्र बोस आदि प्रसिद्ध स्वतंत्रता सेनानियों को प्रेरणा मिली। यही वह समय था जब कुछ विशिष्ट विदेशी विद्वानों, विचारकों और लेखकों ने प्राचीन भारतीय मेधा की मुक्त कंठ से प्रशंसा की। सर विलियम जोन्स 1783 में कलकत्ता उच्च न्यायालय में न्यायाधीश होकर आए। अगले वर्ष उन्होंने बंगाल एशियाटिक सोसाइटी की स्थापना की। उन्होंने कालिदास के अभिज्ञान शाकुंतलम का अंग्रेजी में अनुवाद किया, जिसने यूरोपीय महाकवियों के बीच भारतीय साहित्य को प्रतिष्ठा दी। कर्नल स्लीमैन का भ्रमण वृत्तांत रैम्बो सामने आया, जिसमें भारतीयों के सरल ईमानदार चरित्र का बयान था। 1829 में कर्नल जेम्स टार्ट का प्रसिद्ध ग्रंथ प्रकाशित हुआ, एनल्स एंड एंटीक्विटीज ऑफ राजस्थान, जिसमें राजस्थान के राजपूत वीरों के उत्सर्ग की गौरव गाथा थी। इसी पुस्तक के नाम पर बाद में राजपूताना का नाम राजस्थान रखा गया। मैक्स मुलर ने कैम्ब्रिज के बोर्ड ऑफ हिस्टोरिकल स्टडीज की ओर से इंडियन सिविल सर्विस के प्रशिक्षुओं के समक्ष भारत के बारे में 7 महत्वपूर्ण व्याख्यान दिए, जो इंडिया व्हाट कैन इट टीच अस शीर्षक पुस्तक में प्रकाशित हुए। इन व्याख्यानों में मैक्स मुलर ने भारत की ज्ञान गरिमा, संस्कृत के विशाल साहित्य भंडार और भारतीयों के निर्मल चरित्र को बार बार रेखांकित करते हुए वर्तमान में भी भारत को अपना गुरु बनने लायक देश कहा। नोबेल पुरस्कार प्राप्त प्रसिद्ध फ्रेंच उपन्यासकार रोमारोला ने 1929 में रामकृष्ण परमहंस की जीवनी प्रकाशित की। तो संक्षेप में यह है वह भारतीय और वैश्विक बौद्धिक परिवेश जो भारतीय स्वाधीनता आंदोलन की पृष्ठभूमि में भारतीय बौद्धिक वर्ग को हीनता बोध से मुक्त भारतीय गौरव की अनुभूति करा रहा था। राष्ट्रीय स्वाधीनता आंदोलन के साथ साथ जो साहित्य लिखा जा रहा था, वह अधिकांश तक उससे प्रभावित भी था और उसे प्रभावित भी कर रहा था। हिंदी में जिसे छायावाद काल कहा जाता है, उसे सत्याग्रह युग भी कहा गया है। महात्मा गांधी ने भारत में सत्याग्रह का पहला सफल प्रयोग अप्रैल 1917 में चंपारण में शुरू किया था। उसके बाद का समय आजादी के लिए आंधी में तब्दील होता गया। उस समय की रचनाशीलता में इसकी गूंज सुनी जा सकती है। हिंदी के छायावादी कवियों जयशंकर प्रसाद, सुमित्रानंदन पंत, सूर्यकांत त्रिपाठी निराला और महादेवी वर्मा के काव्य में जो राष्ट्रीयता, भारतीयता और मुक्ति की आकांक्षा है, वह स्वाधीनता और सत्याग्रह काल की ही आकांक्षा है। जयशंकर प्रसाद के नाटकों में राष्ट्रीय चेतना छलकती दिखती है। हिंदी और उर्दू के शीर्ष कथाकार मुंशी प्रेमचंद ने तो गोरखपुर में गांधी का व्याख्यान सुनने के बाद फरवरी 1921 में नौकरी से त्यागपत्र दे दिया था। उनका पहला कहानी संग्रह सोजे वतन अंग्रेज सरकार द्वारा जब्त भी कर लिया गया था। उनकी अनेक कृतियों में अन्याय के विरुद्ध अहिंसात्मक सत्याग्रह का आह्वान हुआ है। उस समय के अनेक बड़े हिंदी लेखक गांधी जी के व्यक्तिगत संपर्क में थे तथा जेल भी गए थे। मैथिली शरण गुप्त, सियाराम शरण गुप्त, माखनलाल चतुर्वेदी, राम नरेश त्रिपाठी, सुभद्रा कुमारी चौहान, जैनेन्द्र कुमार के नाम इस संदर्भ में उल्लेखनीय है। मैथिली शरण और सियाराम शरण गुप्त के घर तो कस्तूरबा के साथ स्वयं बापू पधारे थे। राम नरेश त्रिपाठी का काव्य पथिक और मैथिली शरण गुप्त की भारत भारती, सियाराम शरण गुप्त का बापू, सुभद्रा कुमारी चौहान की प्रसिद्ध कविता झांसी की रानी, माखनलाल चतुर्वेदी की कविता पुष्प की अभिलाषा तथा कैदी और कोकिला आदि से उस समय के स्वतंत्रता सेनानी पर्याप्त प्रेरणा प्राप्त कर रहे थे। हिंदी ही नहीं, उस समय का संपूर्ण भारतीय साहित्य स्वाधीनता की चेतना से आंदोलित था और उसे प्रेरित तथा गतिशील कर रहा था। गांधी जी स्वयं गुजराती के लेखक थे और गुजराती में पंडित युग के बाद के समय को गांधी युग कहा जाता है। इस युग के लेखकों में उमाशंकर जोशी आदि प्रमुख थे। इसी प्रकार तमिल में सुब्रमण्य भारती, रामलिंगम, मलयालम में बल्लतोल जी शंकर कुरुप, उड़िया में फकीर मोहन सेनापति, तेलुगु में लक्ष्मीकांत, कन्नड़ में कुवेम्पु आदि लेखकों के नाम इस संदर्भ में विशेष रूप से उल्लेखनीय है। विश्लेषण करें तो मानव जीवन का हर आयाम मिथकों से, इतिहास से और कालजयी कृतियों क्लासिक्स से प्रभावित मिलेगा। इस संदर्भ में भारत के दो कालजयी महाकाव्यों रामायण और महाभारत का उल्लेख प्रासंगिक होगा, जिसका व्यापक प्रभाव भारत की सभी भाषाओं पर लक्षित किया जा सकता है। भारत के कुछ महान स्वाधीनता सेनानियों पर इनका अमिट प्रभाव देखा जा सकता है। इनमें दो नाम तो अनिवार्य रूप से लेने होंगे, बाल गंगाधर तिलक और महात्मा गांधी के। तिलक महाभारत के एक अंश गीता से इतने प्रभावित थे कि उन्होंने गीता रहस्य नाम से इसका प्रसिद्ध भाष्य भी लिखा। इसी प्रकार गांधी ने अनासक्त योग नाम से उसकी टीका की। तिलक और गांधी दोनों आजीवन गीता से प्रेरणा पाते रहे। गांधी ने अपनी आत्मकथा में कई पुस्तकों का स्वयं पर प्रभाव बताया है तथा हिंद स्वराज के अंत में उन पुस्तकों की सूची दी है जिन्होंने उनके विचारों को पल्लवित पुष्पित किया था। इनमें टॉलस्टॉय की पुस्तक किंगडम ऑफ गॉड इज विद इन यू तथा रस्किन के अनटू द लास्ट के नाम विशेष रूप से उल्लेखनीय है। टॉलस्टॉय के नाम पर गांधी ने दक्षिण अफ्रीका के जोहानिसबर्ग के पास 1910 में टॉलस्टॉय फार्म की भी स्थापना की थी। दक्षिण अफ्रीका में उन्होंने इमर्सन और कार्लाइल की पुस्तकें तथा कुरान, बाइबिल और पातंजल योग दर्शन का भी अध्ययन किया था। गांधी जी भारतीय संत भक्त कवियों से विशेष प्रभावित थे और अपने वक्तव्यों तथा लेखों में उन्होंने नरसिंह मेहता, मीराबाई, कबीर और तुलसीदास की चर्चा की है। हिंद स्वराज में उन्होंने तुलसीदास का यह दोहा विशेष रूप से उद्धृत किया है, दया धर्म को मूल है, देह मूल अभिमान, तुलसी दया न छोड़िए जब लग घट में प्राण। गांधी जी दया बल की चर्चा बराबर करते रहे और तुलसी के रामचरितमानस, जिसे वे रामायण कहते थे, से जीवन भर प्रेरणा लेते रहे। तुलसी का ही प्रभाव था कि वे अंग्रेजी राज को रावण राज तथा राक्षस राज कहते थे और राम राज को अपना आदर्श बताते थे। राम राज को उन्होंने स्वराज भी कहा है और यह महान स्वप्न उन्हें संत कवि तुलसीदास से मिला था। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Thanks a lot, sir, for your so scholarly and insightful and yet very simple inaugural address. Now I invite for the keynote address Professor Harish Trivedi ji and thank him for accepting our invitation to deliver keynote address. Professor Harish Trivedi ji, former professor and head of the Department of English at the University of Delhi. He was visiting professor at the Universities of Chicago and London and has also lectured at various other universities in the USA, the UK, Europe, South America, South Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, China and Japan. He is the author of Colonial Transactions, English Literature and India, and has co-edited The Nation Across the World, Post-Colonial Literary Representations, Literature and Nation, Britain and India, 1800 to 1990, and Post-Colonial Translation, Theory and Practice. He has translated a biography of Premchand into English and also short stories and poems by Premchand, Agnya, Manto, Mohan Rakesh, Raghuveer Sahai, Kunwar Narayan, Kedarnath Singh, and many others. He is one of the contributing editors of an international project based in Stockholm for writing a history of world literature and has contributed to that project a history of South Asian literature. He writes both in English and in Hindi and translates both ways. Hearty welcome, sir.
The President of the Sahitya Academy, Sri Chandrasekhar Kambar, former President of the Sahitya Academy, Vishwanath Prasad Tiwari ji, the Vice President of the Sahitya Academy, Madhav Kaushik ji, the Secretary of the Sahitya Academy, Dr. K. Srinivas Rao ji, Deviyon or Sajjano, as we say in Hindi. There's a kind of gender distinction entirely in favor of women there. The Sahitya Academy has done me a great honor by inviting me to deliver the keynote address at its annual Sahitya Utsav, which is made special this year by being the Amrit Mahotsav, marking the 75th anniversary of our freedom, and also by choosing the freedom movement as the theme of the conference. I feel doubly privileged and triply privileged, therefore, to be invited here. At the beginning of his wonderful lecture, Tiwari ji mentioned how freedom is the ultimate value, is the greatest of all human values. We have just won another victory in the cause of freedom. After 2 years, we have today demonstrated the freedom to be together in the same room. This is so heartening. This is so gladdening. This is such a tremendous affirmation of our common humanity that our joy is absolutely boundless. And there was a crisis that had eclipsed human values, that eroded human values. What is humanity without human beings coming together? So that's another human victory. And I hope that this will not be tentative, that this will not be regressive, that for the rest of what remains of our lives, the shadow would have lifted completely. Because the shadow has lifted, activities are now beginning which were so far only virtual and not real. In Hindi the word is even better, आभासी. आभासी is जिसका आभास तो होता है लेकिन है नहीं. ये मिथ्याभास है जो आभास है. Virtual, there's no virtue in virtual. It's the opposite.
We have a custom RC Musaf.
जी.
आभासी पटल.
So it happens, it so happens, many of you have come here only last night, so have I. I was away at another festival, because festivals are now blooming. I will not say mushrooming, but blooming. And the other festival that I was away at was the Jaipur Literary Festival, which they themselves say, and many other people also say, is the biggest festival in the world. And therefore it follows in many people's minds that it's also the best festival in the world. I do not know about that. The festival where I feel most at home is this festival. At the same time, I did not mind, there was a complete coincidence, as if they had consulted the same Jyotishi. The Sahitya Academy is holding this festival now after a postponement. And the Jaipur Literary Festival is also holding its festival right now after a postponement. Originally, I had accepted invitations to both because they were 1 month apart. But as I said, they went to the same Jyotishi. Or Lagan mil gayi. He told them about that these are the most auspicious dates. So that is one coincidence, one similarity between the Jaipur Literary Festival and the Sahitya Utsav at the Sahitya Academy here. But I must say that there is another coincidence which is even more important. Both the Sahitya Academy and the Jaipur Literary Festival were very choosy about whom to invite for the keynote address. And again, the Jyotishi told them to invite the same person. So, 3 days ago, I delivered the keynote address at the Jaipur Literary Festival, and here I stand before you today doubly humbled, doubly honored at that festival. अब ये मत सोचिए कि मैं अंग्रेजी में ही बोलता रहूंगा, मैं थोड़ा सकपका गया। तिवारी जी ने इतना ओजस्वी, प्रबोधक, लगभग रोमांचक भाषण दिया हिंदी भाषा में कि उसके बाद हिंदी में बोलना असंभव हो गया। लेकिन जयपुर में अपने भाषण में, बीच भाषण में, मैं जब संस्कृत और उर्दू और हिंदी झाड़ के आया हूं, तो थोड़ी हिंदी तो आपके सामने भी बोलूंगा ही। मैंने उनसे क्या कहा कि इतना बड़ा महात्म्य है, प्रताप है जयपुर लिटरेरी फेस्टिवल का, लेकिन मिर्जा गालिब 19वीं शताब्दी में ही जयपुर लिटरेरी फेस्टिवल के बारे में कुछ कह गए थे जो दोहराना आवश्यक है। और मैंने वहां क्या दोहराया है, और भी दुनिया में फेस्टिवल बहुत अच्छे। और मैंने नाम लिया साहित्य अकेडमी के फेस्टिवल का वहां पर, क्योंकि वहां जो लोग हैं वो इसके बारे में नहीं जानते, हम तो उनके बारे में जानते भी हैं, शायद थोड़ा बहुत, ज्यादा नहीं जानते। तो ये क्या है, ये एक प्रकार का प्रस्फुटन है। साहित्यिक कार्यक्रम हो रहे हैं, साहित्यिक लोग इकट्ठा हो रहे हैं, वी ऑल गेटिंग टुगेदर, वी आर कॉन्ग्रीगेटिंग, वी आर शेयरिंग आइडियाज, इज सच ए वंडरफुल थिंग। अगेन ऑल दिस आई हैड टेकन फॉर ग्रांटेड ऑल माय लाइफ until the last 2 years, and because we've been deprived of it, let's value even more the fact that we come together through literature for literature. The theme of the Mahotsav, one other thing that has happened to me, because the two festivals were nearly coinciding, I actually wrote out what I'm going to say. I gave up the freedom to speak extempore. And this new freedom that I've acquired of writing out at least a part of my speech. The theme of the Mahotsav sounds beguilingly simple, which is, as you know, impact of literature on the national freedom movement. It sounds beguilingly simple, but is in fact quite challenging. It would have been far easier had the Sahitya Academy asked us to speak about the impact of the national freedom movement on Indian literature. That is the usual topic. But they have made it challenging to generate new ideas, fresh thoughts, fresh reflections. And this again, we should be grateful for this opportunity, not to repeat what has already been said so many times. The difference here is that the impact of major historical movements is public, it is external, and it is there for everyone to see. Shishir Kumar Das, without mentioning whom I think the Sahitya Academy activities of any kind cannot be complete, his contribution has been so magnificent. In his history of this period of Indian literature said, this period of literature in India can be called the age of Gandhi. What does that show? It shows the impact of the movement on literature. Yes, Gandhi was a writer as well, I will come to that, but he was not primarily a writer. To call him a writer, to identify him primarily as a writer, is to lessen his greatness. I am writing something on Gandhi as a writer, courtesy the Sahitya Academy. You know the series of Makers of Modern Indian Literature. I think at least 500 volumes have come out on that, but there is not a single volume so far on Gandhi. I am now writing that at the invitation of Rao Sahab, and even then I've discovered a lot more about Gandhi as a writer. Everyone knows his collected volumes run to 99, collected works run to 99 volumes. Who has written more? But if he were only a writer, he would not be Gandhi. This, therefore, is the paradox that we are addressing in this conference under this new and challenging theme. The impact of literature, on the other hand, not the impact of freedom movement and movements like that, the impact of literature, on the other hand, is not public, it is personal. It is not external, it is intimate. And it is not immediate, but subtle and enduring, longer lasting. It is therefore more difficult to pinpoint it and to specify it. During our national freedom movement, there were, of course, leaders who were not only major political figures but also writers, though perhaps, and let me make another distinction, they were writers but perhaps not literary writers. There are several kinds of writing, and they're all equally, the authors are to be called equally writers. But we make a distinction. This is the Sahitya Academy. This is not Lekhak Academy. Sahitya is the key word here. Some of them were poets and novelists, and several were autobiographers. We know the names. Rao Sahab has named them, Tiwari ji has named them. There is Gandhi, there is Tilak, there is Nehru, there is Azad, of course there's Ambedkar, there's also Savarkar. All these writers. But most of the literary writers were different from writers who were also leaders in one important respect, and that was that most political leaders cum writers who were both at the same time, they were writers of discursive and polemical prose, which is more effective in a political context, in an immediate political context, than a poem or a novel. In any case, in the first half of the 20th century, as has been pointed out by Dr. Rao, how far did literature travel? How far did books travel? The level of literacy even now is not 100% in our country, very sadly. Then I think it might not even have been 25%. When the British left, it was still below 50%. So, while we believe in literature and will continue to believe in literature, we have also to realize that the society that the literature is about and addresses is a much larger entity and a far more inclusive entity, in which literature is, as has been pointed out already, only one form of communication. In that period particularly, and of course even now, in all periods, actions spoke louder than words. That's the dichotomy that has been pointed out over and over again through the ages. And we must, when we consider the impact of the national freedom movement in relation to the literature produced before, during, and after that, we must take into account that when words fail, action must follow. When action is played out, literature very often follows it rather than leads it. But because I was invited to talk about it, this idea has never before struck me. It struck me only when preparing this. You may think I've come totally unprepared, but that's only a deception. I have one idea that came to me about how to gauge the importance of literature. Yes, all right, we were illiterate, largely, not all of us. Books were printed in 500 copies. Journals like Hindi Pradeep was published 200 copies per month. At great cost, personal cost, to Balakrishna Bhatt. I'll return to that in a moment. But there is another yardstick, and that yardstick is leave alone the impact of literature on the Indians, on the Indian masses. And this new idea that has come to me is, let us look for a moment at the impact of Indian literature to do with the freedom movement on the British, who were trying to suppress all voices asking for freedom. This is something that I would like to go into, because impact can be judged in two different ways. Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the greatest commanders in the history of military commanders in the history of mankind, once said jokingly about his own army, when I look at my soldiers, I don't know whether they frighten the enemy, but by God they frighten me. That's what Napoleon said. So there are two sides on which to judge the impact. How did our literature impact on the British? It has been pointed out, Tiwari ji mentioned it in passing, that they censored a lot of writing during that period. Why would they censor it? Because they thought it dangerous. They thought it offensive, they thought it dangerous, and that is one yardstick by which to measure how strong that writing was. I will cite some examples of that. The action they took was of various kinds. Not only against leaders who were also writers, but also against writers who were merely writers and had no pretensions to be political leaders. So the British government, irrespective of this distinction, regularly took offense that these people had written and published, often banned it, and sometimes found the authors of such works guilty of sedition. What kind of sedition? The word has changed. In Hindi, particularly in many Indian languages, there are different words for sedition then and sedition now. Now it is Deshdroh, then it was Rajdroh. Because the Raj and the Desh were not the same thing in those times. And sentenced these writers to long terms of imprisonment and even exile. I will now very briefly, over the next few minutes, go over some examples of how some of our authors were treated by the British. The first, I have 3 or 4 names. The first name that I would like to take here, and I'm very pleased that Tiwari ji has already mentioned somebody who's considered a twin of the writer that I'm going to mention, Bal Mukund Gupt and Balkrishna Bhatt. Balkrishna Bhatt ran a monthly journal, Hindi journal called Hindi Pradeep. The name was suggested by Bharatendu. Pradeep, the diya, the light that burns, irrespective of how strong the wind is which is trying to blow it out. That is what it said on the title page. Balkrishna Bhatt began this in 1878. In 1877, the British had already passed the first Vernacular Press Act. The Vernacular Press Act was an instrument of suppression, was an instrument of torment, extinction almost, of the vernacular press, which the British had already recognized was far more potent, far more powerful, and far more seditiously suspected than the English language press, even though some of the English language press, like the Tribune of Lahore, like the Leader at Allahabad, like the National Herald, Lucknow, they were owned and edited by the Indians, and they were nationalists. But the British had 2 different rules for publications in English and for publications in the vernacular. So they brought out the first Vernacular Press Act in 1877, and Hindi Pradeep was born in its shadow. And what happened? The British said not only the author of a seditious piece can be punished, the editor can be punished, and the publisher and the printer can also be punished. That's what the Act said. So that it will not be published at all. Many people are found guilty. Hindi Pradeep had to change his printer 8 times within 3 or 4 years in his early years of existence. He was braver than the printers. He was braver than Mahamana Madan Mohan Malviya. Balkrishna Bhatt advised him not to carry some pieces. Malviya ji advised him, and he did, Balkrishna Bhatt. But the peak of it came. Finally Hindi Pradeep died because the government passed a new Vernacular Press Act and demanded a security of 3,000 rupees even before you had published anything offensive. A security in advance, so that if you publish anything at all, that money would be forfeited. Premchand also had to do that. So, Balkrishna Bhatt, in 1888, December last week, 1888, the Indian National Congress held its 4th session in Allahabad. The first 3 sessions had been held in Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, which are of course not Indian cities. They were then even less Indian cities because they were founded by the British. There was nothing there before the British came, some villages. So those sessions being held in those presidency towns, as they were called, meant that the Anglophone elite was the one that was involved in it. When the fourth session came to Allahabad, what it meant was that the Congress was coming to the Hindi heartland, to the national mainstream for the first time. And the British government, the Viceroy, had been patronizing and encouraging of the Indian National Congress for the first 3 years, but Lord Dufferin now indicated very clearly that the Congress could not be held. Auckland Colvin, who was the Lieutenant Governor in UP, whose capital then was Allahabad, the same city, he cancelled the approved venue where the Congress would be held 3 times, one after the other, so that it could not be held at all. Balkrishna Bhatt wrote the longest poem of his life, 151 couplets, and published it in Hindi Pradeep in support of the Congress, trying to assure the British that it was not seditious, that it was beneficial for everyone. And he wrote, Nahi Congress ko kataha kukur. In dialect, in Hindi dialect, Nahi Congress ko kataha kukur. The Congress is not a dog that will bite you, he's saying to the British. The Congress is not a cur, not even dog, kukur. Nahi Congress ko kataha kukur. Nahi Congress koi buri balai. It's not a calamity or disaster for you. Raja praja do hitakari. It will benefit the ruler and the ruled. Raja praja do hitakari, jo jagadishwar hoye sahai. By God's grace. The combination of religion and politics does not begin with Gandhi. It is ingrained in the Indian mind, in the Indian spirit. Everything has to do with religion, and religion is not merely religion. Desh dharm bhi hota hai. Balkrishna Bhatt, well, Tilak, let's go to Tilak. Tilak is of course famous as the radical who split the Congress. Surat Congress in 1907, Naram Dal, Garam Dal, as we were told in Hindi, the extremists and the moderates. Tilak was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. Why? Not because something he had done, but because of something he had published in Kesari, his journal. And the judge who sentenced him, an Indian judge, let's not forget their contribution. Not everybody was nationalist in those times. The Indian judge, relishing the thought of sending Tilak into exile, not only imprisonment, out of India, he said in his judgment, I think it'll be a good thing if the country that you profess to love and you, with your love for that country, are separated for some years. Look at the vindictiveness of the formulation. Gandhiji, well, before that, let me mention in chronological order Subramanya Bharati. Bharati was influenced by Tilak. Bharati was at the Surat Congress, Subramanya Bharati. He had already met Sister Nivedita and got Vivekananda's message. Finally, just before he died in 1921, and last year was his death centenary year, Subramanya Bharati actually met Gandhi also. But he was a radical writer. He was definitely Garam Dal. And what happened to him? He had to exile himself. He had to banish himself. Because the British were about to arrest him. They had arrested his chief collaborator in publishing a journal. So, just in time, like Aurobindo, about the same time, Subramanya Bharati fled from what we now call Chennai to Pondicherry, the French territory. We know that Aurobindo did that, but Subramanya Bharati also did that. And he lived there for 10 years in exile, self-imposed political exile. Another thing about him is, of course he wrote and published in Tamil. His major journal was called Vijaya. And yet, look at the national spirit. On the cover, there would be a map of India and Bharat Mata standing in front of it. You know that depiction, everyone has seen it. But in the Bay of Bengal, in the vacant space, it would say Vande Mataram in Devanagari. Vande Mataram in Devanagari. इसका मतलब ये भी है कि बहुत हो गया.
इसका मतलब बहुत कुछ बोलना भी बाकी है.
नहीं मैं खत्म कर रहा हूँ. आखिर धैर्य की सीमा होती है और लोगों की. मेरे धैर्य की सीमा नहीं है.
हमारे धैर्य की सीमा नहीं है. आप बोलिए धीरे-धीरे.
So Vande Mataram in Devanagari. He represented the national integration of India in that period in a way that most leaders did not, because he had lived in Banaras, Subramanya Bharati, and learned Sanskrit and Hindi apart from English, of course, and Tamil. So, Subramanya Bharati was self-exiled. About Vande Mataram, Tiwari ji has said how songs, folk songs or literary, this is a literary song. And in Anandamath, that's another quality of literature that we sometimes ignore. In Vande Mataram, in Anandamath, there is no mention of the British. We interpreted it later on to be a text against foreign rule. What is the foreign rule described in there? It's Muslim rule. It's a very delicate problem of Indian history and Indian nationalist movement. Allegorically, we turned Muslims into the British. Texts that were written against the Muslims at one time, we reused, we repurposed, as we now say, to stand against the British. But Vande Mataram, what Bharati inscribed on the title page, that was the magic mantra of our freedom. For all kinds of reasons, in 1948, Nehru did not want it as the national anthem. We know that, and there were objections. But throughout that period of nationalist struggle for freedom, it was the mantra. And the government at one stage got so disgusted with the use of Vande Mataram that it banned it. And then another song came out in which the word Vande Mataram was used over and over and over again to defy the government. It was not Vande Mataram, it was a song about Vande Mataram. And one of the lines in that was, Chhin sakti hai nahi sarkar Vande Mataram. And what did the Sarkar do? It banned that song also. One forgets now how it was a cat and mouse game at every step. Gandhi, well, whatever one says about Gandhi is too small and perhaps so partial as to be misleading. I'll say only one thing about him. Well, Gandhi's impact on our poetry, on our literature, on painting. I wrote a chapter on that in the Cambridge Companion to Gandhi some years ago. And what I touched on was not even the tip of the iceberg. It's fantastic. We say Ramayana and Mahabharata. If all literary references to Gandhi are put together, they will constitute a corpus as big as the Mahabharata. It's magic. A man who was a historical figure and lived in our age, he inspired such devotion because of his devotion to freedom. Gandhi was arrested in India for the first time in 1922, shortly after Chauri Chaura, when he had called off the national movement. Well, the charge against him was sedition, but the British put it differently. And the British said the charge was causing and spreading disaffection against the King Emperor George V. Causing and spreading disaffection. अंग्रेजी की धार देखिए आप, जिसको वो लोग सेडिशन कहते हैं, जैसे पहले अफेक्शन था बहुत causing disaffection. And Gandhi went there, and Gandhi at the trial made his statement. Unlike Tilak, Gandhi pleaded guilty. He said, yes, I'm guilty. And he made a statement, and in that he said, once, not too long back, I was a staunch loyalist of the King Emperor. That he was. And he said, but now I have become a sworn disaffectionist. Look at his use of the English language. He says, I have now become a sworn disaffectionist, and it is my life's purpose now to spread this disaffection. So we used all kinds of rhetorical devices also, stylistic devices also, even in common prose, not only in literature. Gandhi had something to say about literature itself. Gandhi was very hard to please in every respect. He said literature is too middle class. It is, whether we accept it or not. A Dalit, a woman, a whoever, tribal, when they begin writing and publishing, they are doing something very middle class. I will not go further into it because I might be beaten up. So let this be saved for some other conference where I have time to develop this. Finally, Premchand. Soze Vatan has been mentioned. तिवारी जी, आपने उस 20-25 मिनट के भाषण में गागर में कितने सागर भरे? I was reminded of Sachidanandan when he used to speak from this podium. In those 25 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, I think you must have mentioned 250 writers. It's amazing. I mean, Vishwakosh.
Yes.
So, Premchand has been mentioned, like many other people have been mentioned. Soze Vatan, how it was banned. Now, what is Soze Vatan, and how did a collection of 5 short stories in Urdu, how do the British know what it contains and that it contains sedition? The British brought out a publication every week of a digest of the vernacular press, which their spies among Indians read and summarized for them. And this was circulated to all the top British officials. That was their source of knowledge. It came from us. As I said, we were not all nationalists. Many of us served the British very faithfully. So, Soze Vatan, I mean, there's so many Hindi scholars here and elsewhere. Can we even name the 5 stories in that collection? It has hardly any significance in Hindi, except a historical significance, no literary significance. But the British DM, and Premchand then was not a schoolmaster, he had been promoted to be a sub-deputy inspector of schools. So the DM summoned him. And Premchand was on tour, DM was on tour, so Premchand sat in a Balgadi and went to the DM in some other village, very far away. And he went there and he entered, he was asked to enter, the DM was sitting there, on his desk there was a copy of Soze Vatan. This is as described by Premchand. So the DM said, did you write this book? And Premchand said yes. And the DM said, it is full of sedition. It is patriotic. I have read those stories over and over again. One of the stories that is actually popular is Duniya ka sabse anmol ratan. That is in Soze Vatan. Yahi mera vatan hai is another story in that. But they're not patently seditious. They're patriotic. Yes. Patriotic in the revivalist Hindu Arya Samaji manner, which was the biggest influence on Premchand in those times. So he said, this is seditious. He said, turn in all the copies of the book, we will burn them. Get all the copies that have been circulated and they'll be destroyed. And never write anything like this again. So what did Premchand say then? No. Before, Premchand of course would not say anything. He was a subordinate official. The DM said, खैर मनाओ कि ये मुगलों का जमाना नहीं है, नहीं तो तुम्हारे हाथ काट के फेंक दिए जाते। ये तो हम हैं जो तुम्हें छोड़े दे रहे हैं। सोचिए, गुनाह भी उनका मान रहे हो, and they're rubbing it in about what great liberals they are. So this was British oppression of Indian literature. Premchand, when he was running his own journals in the last 5 or 6 years of his life, Hans and Jagaran, was running all the time from Banaras to Lucknow. Because the chief secretary of the government was summoning deposit, issuing warnings, and so on. That was the ground level on which writing and writers and literature operated. It's not only in the great classics of that period that we see resistance to British rule, that we see the torch of freedom burning bright. From week to week, from day to day, in our periodical press, it's kept alive. And we need to remember all these landmarks and all these tremendous contributions. And in the papers that are going to follow, I'll be very interested to see, in Tiwariji's great paper, magnificent paper, I was trying to see how much of the literature that he's citing is about an era of Indian history that has gone by, and how much of it is about what is happening now and what may happen in future. I have said here that there is a circularity of impact between literature and life, between poetry and history. And what is the circularity? If we write about Muslim rule, we intended, as I said, it's a very delicate example. It has to be handled very carefully. But if Bankim writes about Muslim rule, is he not aware of British rule and what it is doing? So which is his real target? That's one of the great things about literature, that it seems to be talking about one thing, and it is in fact talking about something else altogether. That's what we value literature for, the connotative value, the symbolic value, the metaphorical value of literature. And the thing that I was going to say was, I'll be very interested to find out in the papers that will follow as to how much are they talking about the impact of the national freedom movement on literature, and to what extent we are talking about the impact of the national freedom movement on literature. Historically, now where we stand 75 years after independence, they seem to be much the same thing. But there was a distinction then, and let's maintain that distinction in our discrimination. You've been an ideal audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for that lovely address, dear Professor Trivedi sir. And I must thank to the virtual Jyotishi as well, who rightly predicted your availability for this festival. Let us now request Professor Chandrasekhar Kambarji, President Sahitya Akademi, to speak as the chair of the inaugural session.
Respected Adharaniya Vishwanath Prasad Tiwari ji, eminent Hindi poet and fellow of Sahitya Akademi. Dear Professor Harish Trivedi ji, eminent writer, critic, translator and scholar, Sri Madhav Kaushik ji, Vice President Sahitya Akademi. my friend Srinivas Rao, Secretary Science Academy and friends. This is a very important seminar in the background of completion of 75 years since India's independence movement. I know it is true of movements and associations all over the world, but I feel every single movement in India had the hand of literature behind. Some people may think it is an overestimate and a hype that literature can play any significant role in any movement, leave alone independence movement. To those friends, I would like to say that please open your eyes and hearts, go through the annals of history and learn. Every single influential leader was influenced by impactful writing, and in turn millions who followed him or her. Indian independence movement was unique and different from the freedom movements of other countries or revolutions movements. It had the influence of religious thinkers, writers and poets who, with the fervor of freedom, moved millions. Great leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, who not only through his speeches but also through his writings, journalists, and then the masses in rural spaces of the country, who are the original practitioners of oral traditions, all contributed to and influenced the movement. India is a land of diverse cultures and large number of languages and dialects, so writings and speeches have to be carried out to other languages all the time to have any meaningful impact. So translators too played significant role in the Indian independence movement. Many will be aware of ferocious and nationalistic writings and speeches in all the Indian languages. Again at the turn of 20th century, every Indian was filled with nationalism and yearning for freedom. All the educated people, without exception, and unlike many other freedom movements, joined struggle and used the very language of the oppressors, English, and wrote voluminously in that language about Indian independence movement and in many genres. So religious literature, poetry, fiction, plays, ballads, pastoral songs, folklore, and a very conceivable form of literature was filled with Indian independence movement and hugely influenced the educated and illiterate alike. Wealthy and poor, pious and atheist, educated and illiterate, villagers and urban folk, all influenced by literature, shook the mighty, blighty, unlike anything before. The fire of freedom fueled by the literary catalysts drove the Britishers out. Those who are born in the recent decades may not have any idea about all this. It is for the benefit of such scholars and conscious readers also to record the literary influences on freedom movement on the occasions of the 75th year of Indian independence that we are organizing this seminar. I sincerely hope everyone who is participating, as well as those literature lovers who are attending this seminar, stand benefited by the proceedings. Wonderful scholars are going to present their perspective on all that what I have said. My best wishes to all of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now I request respected Madhav Kaushikji, Vice President, Sahitya Academy and distinguished poet, writer in Hindi, to make concluding remarks.
परम श्रद्धेय गुरुवर विश्वनाथ प्रसाद तिवारी जी, आदरणीय अध्यक्ष महोदय चंद्रशेखर कंबार जी, परम श्रद्धेय हरीश त्रिवेदी जी, राव साहब और सभी विद्वान मित्रों, 3 महासागरों के बाद अगर किसी को कहा जाए कि इसको समेट लो तो मेरी स्थिति क्या रही होगी, अंदर से आप सोच सकते हैं। और ऐसे वक्तव्य सुन के तो आदमी अवाक हो जाता है। हम जैसे जो सारा दिन बोलते रहते हैं, कई बार लगता है शब्द नहीं है। खैर, जब जिम्मेवारी दी है तो थोड़ा कोशिश करूंगा। तिवारी जी ने 2 बातें कही। स्वायत्तता सबसे बड़ा जीवन मूल्य है और साहित्यकारों ने सबसे बड़ा बलिदान उसी के लिए दिया है। उन्होंने 2 साहित्यकारों को कोट किया, रूसो और वोल्टेयर। वोल्टेयर कहते हैं कि मैं हर हाल में आपकी असहमति का सम्मान करूंगा, चाहे मेरा अपना जीवन खतरे में क्यों न पड़े, आपकी असहमति का सम्मान। रूसो कहता है कि समानता, बंधुत्व, भाईचारा, इक्वलिटी, फ्रेटर्निटी एंड लिबर्टी, ये 2 ऐसी सिद्धांत थे जिनको लेके हमारा पूरा देश चला। पूरा फ्रीडम मूवमेंट के बीच की आधारशिला इन 2 चीजों ने रखी है, गांधी से लेके अम्बेडकर तक। असमानता और असहमति, उस समय मैं 2-4 जिक्र करूंगा, विद्वानों ने जो कुछ कह दिया उसको दोहराने की कोई आवश्यकता नहीं। आज 75 साल बाद जब हम सब चीजों का मूल्यांकन कर रहे हैं तो कई बार ऐसा लगता है कि हम चीजों को ठीक से परिभाषित भी नहीं कर रहे, समझ भी नहीं कर रहे। असहमति की हालत ये थी कि महात्मा गांधी और रविंद्रनाथ टैगोर मुद्दों पे असहमत थे, लेकिन एक दूसरे के प्रति अगाध प्रेम। सुभाष बोस और गांधी जी असहमत थे, लेकिन सुभाष उन्हें महात्मा का दर्जा देता है, अपनी ब्रिगेड का नाम उन पे रखता है। नेहरू पटेल के थे, लेकिन फिर भी हर हाल में असहमत होते हुए एक थे और इस देश को एक बना। क्या वो सब अब है? जिन बड़े साहित्यकारों का इन्होंने जिक्र किया, माखनलाल चतुर्वेदी जी ने तो गांधी के आने से पहले कविता लिख दी थी। उनके दक्षिण अफ्रीका के उस संघर्ष को देखते हुए उस समय के जितने पत्रकार थे, शंभू के चिट्ठे, बालकृष्ण गुप्त जी का, बालमुकुंद गुप्त जी का, कहते हैं कि करजन सुबह उठते ही किसी को बुला के उसका अंग्रेजी अनुवाद सुनता था उन्होंने क्या लिखा। ये सारी चीजें, कई बार ऐसा नहीं लगता कि जब देश गुलाम था तो हमारे साहित्यकार आजाद थे, और आज देश आजाद है और हमारे साहित्यकार, मुझे कहने की आवश्यकता नहीं। मित्रों, ये चीजें हमें सोचने पे विवश करती हैं। हमारे पंजाब में खटकड़ कला में एक म्यूजियम है भगत सिंह का। जब भी जालंधर दूरदर्शन पे जाता हूँ तो हम वहाँ जरूर रुकते हैं। उसमें उनकी सारी चीजें रखी हुई हैं। एक जगह उनकी डायरी का एक पन्ना है, उस पे 4 पंक्तियां लिखी हुई है और वो भीगा हुआ है। उसी के साथ उनका होल्डर भी रखा हुआ है। बड़े ध्यान से मैंने पढ़ा पिछले, हालांकि कई बार देख चुका था, वो डायरी का पन्ना भी नजर आता था, लेकिन कभी पढ़ने की कोशिश नहीं की। उसमें उन्होंने अपने हाथ से लिखा है, देयर इज नॉट टू मेक रिप्लाई, देयर इज नॉट टू रीजन वाई, but there is but to do and die, there is but to do and die। टेनिसन की शायद चार्ज ऑफ लाइट ब्रिगेड का ये आखिरी पंक्ति है। उस समय का साहित्यकार विश्व के साहित्यकारों से कितना प्रभावित था, ये भी देख के चलिए। टोल्स्टॉय के आप पुनरुत्थान को पढ़ेंगे, आपको लगेगा कि गांधी ने बहुत कुछ अपनी सैद्धांतिकी उनसे ली हुई है। उसी तरह की चीजें, ये विश्व साहित्य का असर था कि हमारे साहित्यकारों पे पड़ा। साहित्यकारों को समझ आ गया कि इस देश को आज़ाद कराने से पहले दो चीज़ें इनको सिखानी पड़ेंगी। एक तो ये जो सेंस ऑफ इन्फीरियरिटी इनमें आ गई है, ये कमतरी का एहसास, ये इनके ऊपर बेताल की तरह बैठ गया, इनको दबाता रहेगा, मारता रहेगा। इस कमतरी के एहसास से मुक्त करिए। इसलिए उन्होंने अतीत का गौरवगान किया, उसके अलावा कोई चारा भी नहीं था। दूसरा उनके दिमाग में आया, जब कमतरी का एहसास खत्म होगा तभी ये थोड़े निडर बनेंगे, थोड़ी ताकत आएगी। उस समय की आप सारी कविताएं पढ़िए। टैगोर लिखते हैं वेयर माइंड इज विदाउट फियर। सुब्रमण्यम भारती की कविता आजकल आप हिंदी में अनुवाद पढ़ेंगे, निर्भय बनो, निर्भय बनो, निर्भय बनो। गांधी जी भी यही कहते थे, निडर बनो। एक तरह पूरी भारतीयता की जो एकात्मकता है वो उस समय के साहित्य में है। और आपको लगेगा कि फकीर मोहन सेनापति को पढ़ते हुए आपको लगेगा कि होरी यहाँ भी है। वो वहाँ खड़ी बोली बोलता था या यहाँ के उड़िया में बात कर रहा है। आप नीचे जाओगे तो आपको लगेगा कि चाहे वो मलयालम का, मैं लेखकों के नाम इसलिए नहीं बता रहा हूँ, इन्होंने 500 से ज़्यादा बता दिए और उनको दोहराने की कोई आवश्यकता नहीं। एक मित्रों, डॉक्टर साहब ने एक बड़ा कमाल का जिक्र किया। मेरे परिवार में हमारे 2 दादाजी ऐसे थे जो कांग्रेस के बड़े कार्यकर्ता रहे हैं, उन्होंने बड़ा सफ़र भी किया है, लेकिन जिस दिन देश आज़ाद हुआ उन्होंने कांग्रेस छोड़ दी थी। तो मैंने उनसे पूछा कि उस ज़माने में जब साक्षरता ही नहीं थी, चीज़ें बड़ी कम छपती थी, आपने अपने विचारों का इतना बड़ा प्रचार प्रसार कैसे किया? तो हंस के बताते हैं, कहते हैं तुम्हारी समझ में ये बात नहीं आएगी, हमारे यहाँ कम्युनिटी रीडिंग होती थी। कहता मेरे यहाँ अखबार आता था, पूरे गांव को मैं पढ़ के सुनाता था। फिर वो अखबार पड़ोसी के गांव में जाता था, वो पढ़ के सुनाता था। कहता सरकार ने सोजे वतन बैन कर दी थी, हमने सोजे वतन पूरे देश को इसी तरह पढ़ा दी और बड़ी आसानी से बताता था। कहता जब्त शुदा नज़्मों की किताब तो बैन होगी, हमें मुझे जवानी याद है। कहता हम उनको सुनाते थे। एक और उन्होंने कमाल की बात बताई। कहता जब वर्नाकुलर एक्ट आ गया और ये सारी चीजें छपनी बंद हुई तो हमारी सबसे बड़ी मदद हमारे लोक गीतकारों ने की है। वो कहते हजारों हजार लोकगीत आला की शक्ल में, रागनियों की शक्ल में। और तिवारी जी का मैं बड़ा आभारी हूँ, जब ये कन्वीनर थे, मेरा सौभाग्य था कि मैं उस समय हिंदी बोर्ड में था। एक इन्होंने कहा कि लोक भाषा में 1857 के बाद जितनी लोक भाषा में रचनाएं हैं, 24 भाषाओं के हम 24 ग्रंथ तैयार करेंगे। वो काम किसी न किसी स्तर पे चल रहा है। हमारे सामने अब संकट ये है, वो इतना बड़ा विपुल भंडार है, हम पता नहीं उन्हें छाप पाएंगे या नहीं पाएंगे। ये राव साहब के लिए मुसीबत है, हम तो इकट्ठा करके दे देंगे इन्हें। तो आप अंदाजा लगाइए कि वो निरक्षर लोग हैं, पढ़ नहीं सकते, लेकिन उन्होंने एक दूसरे तक अपनी बात पहुंचाने के लिए उन मंचों का इस्तेमाल किया, चौपाल का इस्तेमाल किया। अब मेरे विचार से हमें वो अगले सत्र का भी ध्यान रखना चाहिए। समंदर को समेट पाना बहुत मुश्किल है भाइयों, लेकिन एक बात जरूर मैं कहना चाहूँगा कि गांधी जी हिंदी साहित्य सम्मेलन के 3 बार अध्यक्ष रहे। साहित्यकारों को उन्होंने जिस अंदाज से प्रभावित किया, और साहित्यकारों ने भी उन्हें, हमेशा प्रभाव बाइपोलर होता है, कोई ये नहीं कह सकता कि सिर्फ उन्होंने साहित्य को किया, साहित्यकारों ने भी किया। और साहित्यकारों ने इतना जबरदस्त किया कि उनकी लेखनी भी कभी नहीं रुकती थी। अब हम उस किस कोटि में, जब देश के हालात कुछ और थे, उस समय देश को आज़ाद कराना। अब एक निवेदन साहित्य अकादमी के इस आयोजन का ये भी है, देश की आज़ादी के बाद साहित्यकारों का काम समाप्त नहीं हुआ है। वो काम पहले से ज़्यादा जटिल है, पहले से ज़्यादा मुश्किल भी है। तब हमें अपने दुश्मन का पता था, अब वो सब अदृश्य है। अब आपको उनसे लड़ना है जो दुर्भावनाएं, हमारे राष्ट्रीय आंदोलन में सामाजिक दुर्भावनाओं को हमने निर्मूल कर दिया था। सियाराम शरण गुप्त से लेके उनकी आप रचनाएं पढ़ेंगे, किस तरह से हमने उन बेड़ियों को तोड़ा था। वो बेड़ियां फिर सामने आ रही हैं। वो सारी चीजें बगैर सेंसर के भी संकट की तरह से हैं। ये काम साहित्यकारों का है। कलम के सिपाही अगर तुम न जागे, वतन के मसीहा वतन बेच देंगे। ये भी उस जमाने के लिखे हुए लोगों की है। मैं आपको दो सूचनाएं जरूर देना चाहूँगा। साहित्य अकादमी के हमारे दो प्रकाशन हैं। स्वतंत्रता पुकारती हिंदी का हमारा एक संग्रह है कविताओं का, जो उस जमाने में लिखी गई थी। वो पुस्तक अगर उपलब्ध है हमारे यहाँ। और एक हमने जब्त शुदा नज़में, वो किताब भी हमने छापी हुई है। उनको पढ़ते हुए आपको लगेगा कि गुलाम देश का साहित्यकार कितना आज़ाद होता है और एक लिबरेटेड आदमी ही समाज को लिबरेट कर सकता है। धन्यवाद।
Thank you. Well, the inaugural session ends here, and as the printed program goes, there is a tea break now, but we will avoid to have a break by definition, and have tea and immediately come back and simultaneously begin our next session. That is the first session, and will be chaired by Professor Nandakishore Acharya ji. The session is titled Nationalist Literature and the Idea of Freedom.